Somewhere inside the American power grid right now, there is code that does not belong there. Nobody put it there to steal your data. Nobody put it there to shut off your lights today. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that distinction matters more than almost anything else happening in national security right now. It has been sitting quietly inside transformers, substations, and control systems for years, waiting for the exact moment. Someone in Beijing decides it is time to flip the switch. And in August of 2026, the United States Air Force finally admitted, through a quiet $7 million contract announcement, that the old way of defending the grid is no longer good enough. They are not just patching software anymore. They are quantum-proofing the actual power grid of the United States. And China is watching every single move. If that sounds dramatic, it should, because this is not a hypothetical threat dreamed up by a defense contractor trying to win a bigger budget. This is a documented ongoing infiltration that intelligence agencies across the United States have been tracking for years, and it just collided head-on with the exact same quantum computing revolution, reshaping artificial intelligence, cryptography, and national security all at once. Two massive stories, one about hackers already living inside American infrastructure, and one about a computing revolution that could eventually make every lock protecting that infrastructure obsolete, just merged into a single urgent problem happening right now, not somewhere off in a distant future decade. And the people whose job it is to protect the country decided they could not afford to wait any longer. Let's start with the actual news, because the details matter here more than the headline alone. In early August of 2026, the Air Force Research Laboratory, known as AFRL, the Air Force's primary hub for advanced technology development, awarded a 24-month, $7 million contract to Eaton Corporation, a major power management company. The goal is to apply quantum computing, machine learning, and advanced visualization technology directly towards strengthening the resilience and security of the American electric grid. Eaton is not doing this alone. The company is working alongside Inflection, a quantum hardware provider, and researchers at Pennsylvania State University, combining real quantum computing expertise with decades of practical power engineering experience. Here's what makes this project genuinely different from a typical government cybersecurity contract. It is not just about encrypting data better. It is about fundamentally rethinking how the grid detects and responds to threats that arrive from multiple directions at once. Right now, American grid infrastructure is required to withstand what regulators call N-2. Planning, meaning the system has to keep functioning even if two major pieces of equipment fail at exactly the same time. That standard was designed decades ago around a very specific kind of threat: accidental equipment failure, a downed line during a storm, a transformer that overheats. It was never designed around a coordinated adversary deliberately triggering multiple simultaneous failures, both physical and digital, at the exact moment of their choosing. That is precisely the gap this new quantum initiative is trying to close. The project aims to use quantum-enabled algorithms and hybrid, quantum classical methods to help grid operators detect, visualize, and respond to multiple, concurrent, unpredictable threat combinations, the kind of layered attack a sophisticated state actor could actually pull off. Think about what that really means in practice. Instead of a control room operator staring at a wall of dashboards, trying to piece together whether three separate alarms happening at once are a coincidence or a coordinated attack, quantum accelerated visualization tools could process an overwhelming combination of physical sensor data and cyber threat indicators simultaneously. Spotting patterns, a human analyst, or even a traditional computer would take far too long to piece together on their own. Why does the Air Force specifically care about the civilian power grid in the first place? That is a fair question, and the answer says a lot about how differently the military now thinks about modern warfare. Air Force bases across the United States do not run on some separate, isolated military power system. They plug directly into the same commercial electric grid that powers your home, your hospital, and your local grocery store. If an adversary manages to take down large sections of the civilian grid during a moment of geopolitical crisis, military readiness gets crippled right alongside everyday civilian life, without a single missile ever being fired. Protecting the grid is not a side project for the Air Force anymore. It has become a core national security mission, because modern warfare increasingly starts in the electrical wiring long before it ever reaches a battlefield. Now let's talk about why this particular moment, August 2026, and not 5 years earlier or 5 years later, because the timing here is not a coincidence, and understanding the backstory is where this entire story becomes genuinely alarming. Back in May of 2023, Microsoft publicly identified a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group that researchers named Volt Typhoon. What made Volt Typhoon different from typical cyber espionage groups was immediately obvious to anyone who studied its behavior. Most state-sponsored hackers steal information, financial data, intellectual property, government secrets. Volt Typhoon was not stealing anything. It was breaking into American critical infrastructure, power utilities, water systems, communications, networks, and then simply sitting there, quietly maintaining access, month after month, year after year, without doing anything visibly destructive at all. In November of 2023, the FBI called the assistant general manager of a small electric and water utility in Littleton, Massachusetts, to deliver news that should send a chill down anyone's spine. Chinese, state-sponsored hackers had been living inside that utility's systems for nearly 10 months, not stealing customer data, not disrupting service, just sitting there, embedded, patient, positioned. That pattern repeated across dozens of utilities nationwide. And by March of 2024, the FBI, CISA, the NSA, and intelligence, partners across the Five Eyes Alliance, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, issued a coordinated joint warning about exactly what Volt Typhoon appeared to be doing. FBI Director Christopher Wray put it in the starkest terms possible, stating publicly that China's hackers are targeting American civilian critical infrastructure, prepositioning themselves specifically to cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities in the event of a future conflict. That is not espionage in any traditional sense. That is something closer to a digital special forces unit, quietly embedding itself behind enemy lines years before any shot is ever fired, waiting for a signal from Beijing that may or may not ever come. And here is the part that should genuinely worry you. This threat did not go away after the public warnings in 2024. According to Dragos, a cybersecurity firm that specializes specifically in protecting industrial control systems and operational technology, a Volt Typhoon, tracked under the internal code name VoltSite, continued actively compromising American electric, oil, and gas companies throughout 2025 and remained active heading into 2026. Dragos researchers described the group as having moved beyond simply gaining initial access. They were, in the company's own words, getting inside the control loop, meaning they had worked their way deep enough into these systems to potentially manipulate the actual physical equipment controlling power distribution, not just observe it from the outside. Alongside Volt Typhoon, a second Chinese state-linked group researchers call Salt Typhoon has been simultaneously targeting American telecommunications networks, and together, the two groups represent what several cybersecurity analysts have called the most serious confirmed penetration of American infrastructure by a foreign adversary since the Cold War. And by early 2026, with tensions between Washington and Beijing already elevated over semiconductor export restrictions and conflict in the Middle East, putting global military posture on edge, security researchers stopped describing the question of what these groups are positioned to do as theoretical. It had become a live, active concern sitting at the center of national security planning. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything about why the Air Force suddenly moved so aggressively on quantum grid. Security in the middle of 2026. This is not a government agency spending money on futuristic technology just because quantum computing sounds impressive in a press release. This is a direct, urgent response to years of documented ongoing infiltration by a sophisticated foreign adversary who has already proven it can get deep inside the exact systems this new contract is designed to protect. The quantum computing angle is not the headline. It is the tool being built specifically because the threat underneath it has already been proven real, repeatedly, over years of documented intrusions. So how does quantum computing actually help against a threat like this? This is where a lot of coverage gets sloppy, so let's be precise about it. There are really two separate but connected quantum challenges facing the power grid right now, and the Air Force's new contract with Eaton addresses primarily one of them, while a much larger, industry-wide effort is quietly addressing the other. The first challenge is exactly what the Eaton contract targets directly, using quantum computing as an offensive-defensive tool, meaning using quantum-accelerated algorithms to actually get better at detecting and responding to threats faster than classical computers ever could. Grid operators today are drowning in data. Every substation, every transformer, every sensor across a sprawling, interconnected national grid generates a constant stream of information. Figuring out which combination of anomalies represents an actual coordinated attack versus normal operational noise is an extraordinarily complex pattern recognition problem, especially when an adversary is deliberately trying to make their interference look like random equipment failure. Quantum computing, paired with machine learning and advanced visualization, is specifically suited to sifting through that kind of overwhelming, multidimensional complexity faster and more accurately than traditional computing approaches allow, giving human operators a genuine fighting chance at catching a coordinated attack before it can cascade into a widespread blackout. The second challenge is completely different, and honestly, in the long run, it might be even more consequential. It has nothing to do with using quantum computers as a defensive tool, and everything to do with defending against quantum computers as an offensive weapon. This is the same broader post-quantum cryptography challenge facing banks, tech companies, and governments worldwide, but applied specifically to the power grid's own control systems and communications. Just like your bank account or your private messages, the power grid relies on encryption to protect the commands flowing between control centers, substations, and field equipment. If that encryption gets broken by a future quantum computer capable of running Shor's algorithm at scale, an adversary would not just be able to read grid communications. They could potentially forge legitimate-looking commands, telling equipment to do things it should never do, at a scale and precision no purely physical sabotage attempt could ever match. This is exactly why the same period covered by this story also saw the Air Force separately funding post-quantum cryptography, specifically for its own most sensitive operational systems. In January of 2026, a company called Q Secure won a small business innovation research contract specifically tied to Air Force Global Strike Command, the branch responsible for America's most enduring strategic platforms, including the B-52 bomber fleet. That contract focused specifically on delivering post-quantum encryption capable of meeting Impact Level 6 classification requirements, the security tier reserved for the most sensitive classified information the government handles. Q-Secure's own leadership described this work as directly supporting cryptographic resilience for the strategic deterrence mission, the unmistakable language of an organization that fully expects quantum computers to eventually threaten the encryption protecting America's most critical command and control systems, and is racing to get ahead of that threat before it materializes. Put those two threads together, quantum accelerated grid threat detection through the Eaton contract, and post-quantum encryption for the Air Force's most sensitive strategic communications through the Q-Secure contract, and you start to see the full shape of what is actually happening. The Air Force is not treating quantum computing as a single, isolated technology bet. It is treating it as a two-sided coin, useful both as a powerful new defensive tool and as an urgent new category of threat that has to be neutralized before it becomes operational, and it is funding real, concrete projects addressing both sides, simultaneously, rather than waiting for a single silver bullet solution to appear. This broader post-quantum urgency is not unique to the military either. It reflects a massive government-wide push happening across the entire United States federal system right now. According to a detailed 2025 analysis from the Computing Research Association, the federal government's own estimated cost of transitioning non-national security computer systems alone to post-quantum cryptography sits at roughly $7.1 billion, tied to an aggressive federal deadline targeting full migration by 2035. That is a massive, sustained, multi-decade undertaking, and it requires coordination across dozens of federal agencies, thousands of private contractors, and an enormous, sprawling web of legacy computer systems, many of which were never designed with any kind of easy cryptographic upgrade path in mind at all. It is worth pausing here to explain, in plain terms, exactly why quantum computers threaten encryption in the first place, because understanding that mechanism is what makes the urgency behind all of this make sense. Almost all of today's standard encryption, the kind protecting bank transactions, government communications, and yes, the control systems running the power grid, relies on a mathematical trick. Multiplying two enormous prime numbers together is fast and easy for any computer. Taking the resulting giant number and figuring out which two primes created it in reverse is so difficult for a classical computer that it would take longer than the age of the universe to solve for sufficiently large numbers. That massive imbalance, trivially easy one direction, essentially impossible the other direction, is the entire foundation of the encryption protecting most of the digital world today. Quantum computers, if they become powerful and stable enough, break that imbalance completely. A mathematician named Peter Shor discovered back in 1994 that a sufficiently capable quantum computer could run an algorithm that solves that reverse factoring problem dramatically faster than any classical computer ever could, turning a calculation that used to be practically impossible into something that becomes achievable in a matter of hours or even minutes. For decades, this remained purely theoretical, because nobody had built a quantum computer big enough or stable enough to actually run it at meaningful scale. That comfort zone has been steadily shrinking every single year, as quantum hardware companies continue pushing qubit counts higher and error correction techniques become more sophisticated and reliable. This is exactly why security researchers keep using a specific phrase to describe the real danger sitting in front of us right now, a phrase called harvest now, decrypt later. An adversary does not need a working quantum computer today to benefit from one eventually. All they need to do is intercept and quietly store encrypted grid communications right now, patiently, and simply wait. If Chinese state-sponsored actors have already achieved the kind of deep access to American grid control systems that Dragos and other cybersecurity researchers have documented, it is entirely reasonable to assume that some of that access has included capturing encrypted command traffic flowing between control centers and field equipment. That captured data does not need to be readable today to be dangerous. It just needs to still exist, sitting quietly in some server somewhere, waiting for the day a capable enough quantum computer finally arrives to unlock it. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely two-sided, because the headline specifically points out that China is watching. And that framing deserves real scrutiny, because it works in both directions simultaneously, and understanding both sides is what actually makes this story matter geopolitically rather than just technically. On one side, China is watching in the sense that Chinese intelligence services are almost certainly tracking exactly what the American defense establishment is doing to shore up grid security. The same way American intelligence agencies track Chinese military and infrastructure developments. Every public contract announcement, every published research paper, every open testimony to Congress about grid vulnerabilities gives Beijing valuable insight into exactly where American defenses are strongest and where meaningful gaps might still remain. That is simply the nature of great power competition in the modern era, an ongoing mutual surveillance of each other's defensive posture, playing out largely through open, source intelligence gathered from public announcements just like this one. On the other side, China is watching because Beijing has its own enormous parallel quantum computing ambitions, and every American move in this space gets carefully measured against China's own progress. China has poured staggering sums into quantum research, including a recently announced state fund worth roughly $138 billion covering quantum information science, alongside artificial intelligence and several other strategic technologies. Chinese researchers have made genuine published progress in quantum communications and quantum computing hardware. And Chinese state media routinely frames these advances as part of a broader national push to achieve technological dominance across every strategic frontier by the year 2035. When the American Air Force publicly signals that it is racing to quantum harden its own critical infrastructure, that signal gets read in Beijing not just as a defensive move, but as an acknowledgement of exactly how seriously Washington now treats the quantum threat, which in turn shapes how aggressively Chinese planners might choose to accelerate their own offensive quantum research timeline. There is also a third, quieter dimension to why China is watching so closely, and it connects directly back to Volt Typhoon and the years of pre-positioned access already sitting inside American infrastructure. If Chinese state-linked hackers have genuinely achieved the kind of deep, persistent access to grid control systems that cybersecurity researchers have documented, then every American move to harden that same infrastructure against future quantum threats directly affects the long-term value of access Beijing has already spent years quietly establishing. A patient adversary who spent a decade embedding itself inside American grid systems does not want to watch that investment become obsolete overnight because the target suddenly upgraded its encryption and detection capability. That gives China a very direct, very practical incentive to monitor exactly how fast and how thoroughly American grid hardening efforts actually progress, because the timeline of that hardening effort directly determines how much longer Beijing's existing access inside the grid remains genuinely useful. It is worth spending a little more time on what Volt Typhoon's specific techniques actually looked like, because the sophistication involved explains why this threat proved so difficult to detect in the first place. Rather than relying on custom malware that antivirus software might eventually catch, Volt Typhoon specialized in what security researchers call living off the land techniques, meaning the group used legitimate, built-in administrative tools already present on a target's own network to move around and maintain access, rather than installing obviously suspicious foreign software. That approach let the group blend into normal, everyday network activity almost seamlessly, making its presence extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from an ordinary system. Administrator doing routine maintenance work, compromised home and small office routers were frequently used as intermediate hops to further disguise the true origin of the group's activity, routing traffic through innocent-looking consumer devices scattered across the country before it ever reached the actual target infrastructure. This is precisely the kind of patient, technically sophisticated tradecraft that separates a serious state-sponsored intelligence operation from an ordinary criminal hacking group looking for a quick payout. And it is exactly why the group evaded widespread public detection for as long as it did. The sectors Volt Typhoon targeted tell their own story too, and the pattern is worth walking through carefully. Communications, networks, manufacturing facilities, utility companies, transportation systems, construction firms, maritime infrastructure, government agencies, educational institutions. That is not a random collection of targets an opportunistic criminal group might stumble into while looking for easy financial fraud. That is, a deliberately selected cross-section of exactly the infrastructure a military planner would want, compromised in advance if preparing for a potential future conflict, particularly one centered around a scenario like a confrontation over Taiwan. Guam specifically drew early attention from researchers, given the island's critical importance as a forward staging base for American military operations across the Pacific, and its inclusion among Volt. Typhoon's earliest documented targets in 2021 strongly reinforced the theory that this campaign was always fundamentally about military readiness and contingency planning rather than ordinary espionage or financial gain. Alongside Volt Typhoon, it is worth understanding Salt Typhoon a little more closely too, since the two campaigns together paint a much fuller picture of the overall threat landscape driving this new wave of infrastructure hardening. Salt Typhoon, tracked separately by Microsoft and CrowdStrike, focused its efforts specifically on American telecommunications providers, reportedly gaining access to systems used for lawful government wiretapping requests, along with the private communications of numerous government officials and political figures. Where Volt Typhoon appears focused on pre-positioning for potential future disruption, Salt Typhoon's activity looks considerably more focused on ongoing active intelligence collection happening right now, giving Chinese intelligence services a persistent window into sensitive American communications infrastructure. Together, these two campaigns represent parallel tracks of the same broader strategic effort, one focused on quiet, patient sabotage potential, and the other focused on active, ongoing surveillance, both operating simultaneously across different layers of American critical infrastructure. Dragos, the industrial cybersecurity firm tracking this activity most closely, publishes an annual threat report specifically focused on operational technology, the specialized industrial control systems running power plants, water treatment facilities, and manufacturing equipment. Distinct from the ordinary office computer networks, most cybersecurity coverage tends to focus on, according to that report, the total number of distinct threat groups actively targeting operational technology worldwide climbed to 26 by early 2026, with 11 of those groups confirmed active during 2025 alone, and 3 entirely new groups emerging that year. Dragos CEO Robert Lee specifically highlighted that VoltSite, the codename Dragos uses for activity, highly correlated with the broader Volt Typhoon campaign, had progressed beyond simple network access toward genuine control loop penetration, meaning the group had worked its way deep enough into these systems to potentially influence the actual physical processes those systems control, not merely observe data flowing through them from a safe distance. That distinction matters enormously to anyone working in industrial cybersecurity, because access to a control loop represents the difference between passive espionage and genuine sabotage capability sitting dormant and ready. Let's talk about why 2026 specifically became the moment American defense planners decided enough evidence had accumulated to justify this kind of dedicated quantum grid security investment. Tension between Washington and Beijing had already been building steadily for years over semiconductor export restrictions, with the United States progressively tightening controls on advanced chip technology reaching Chinese companies, and China responding with its own retaliatory trade measures and export restrictions on critical materials like rare earth minerals essential to American manufacturing. Layer on top of that a period of heightened military tension connected to conflict in the Middle East, which analysts noted had already stretched American military attention and resources across multiple simultaneous global hotspots, and you start to understand why 2026 specifically felt like the moment this particular threat could no longer be treated as a distant theoretical concern sitting in a classified briefing somewhere. Intelligence assessments increasingly framed the question of what Volt Typhoon's pre-positioned access might eventually be used for, not as an abstract possibility, but as a genuinely live contingency that defense planners needed active countermeasures for today, not 5 years from now. It also helps to understand the broader institutional context behind the Air Force Research Laboratory itself, since AFRL is not simply a single research building somewhere handing out occasional contracts. It operates as the Air Force's primary hub for air, space, and cyberspace warfighting technology development, coordinating work across 9 distinct technology areas and roughly 40 operational sites scattered across the country. That scale matters, because it means the Eaton Grid security contract does not exist in isolation. It represents one piece of an enormously broad, coordinated technology development effort spanning everything from hypersonic weapons, research to space-based sensing, to exactly the kind of quantum computing and cybersecurity work discussed throughout this story. Understanding AFRL's full scope helps explain why a $7 million grid security contract, a genuinely modest sum by defense spending standards, still carries real institutional weight, because it reflects a deliberate prioritization decision made by an organization managing an enormous competing portfolio of research priorities across the entire military technology landscape. Let's return to the technical side of quantum computing for a moment, because understanding exactly what makes quantum algorithms genuinely useful for grid security, beyond just sounding impressive in a press release, helps clarify why this specific approach was chosen over more conventional cybersecurity upgrades. Classical computers process information sequentially, working through calculations one after another, even when running many parallel processes simultaneously across multiple processor cores. Quantum computers, by contrast, exploit a genuinely strange property of quantum physics called superposition, allowing quantum bits, or qubits, to represent multiple possible states simultaneously rather than being locked into a single definite value, the way a classical bit is. When applied to an optimization problem, searching through an enormous number of possible combinations to find the one that matches a specific pattern, that property allows certain quantum algorithms to explore many possible solutions at once, rather than checking each possibility one at a time, the way a classical computer fundamentally has to. For a problem like correlating thousands of simultaneous sensor readings across a national power grid to determine whether a specific combination represents a coordinated attack, that kind of parallel exploration capability could genuinely outperform classical approaches once quantum hardware matures enough to handle problems of that scale reliably. That maturity caveat matters enormously, though, and it is worth being honest about where quantum computing technology actually stands today, rather than overselling its current capabilities. Today's quantum computers remain what researchers call noisy intermediate-scale quantum devices, meaning they are powerful enough to demonstrate genuinely useful capabilities on certain narrow, specialized problems, but still far too limited and error-prone to replace classical computing for general-purpose tasks, or to run the kind of large-scale, fully error-corrected calculations that would be needed to actually break modern encryption through Shor's algorithm at meaningful real-world scale. This is exactly why the Eaton contract specifically describes its approach as hybrid quantum classical methods, rather than a pure quantum replacement for existing grid monitoring systems. Realistically, over the coming 24 months, this project will most likely produce proof-of-concept demonstrations and specialized algorithms designed to run on quantum hardware for very specific, narrowly defined pattern recognition tasks, working alongside conventional classical computing systems that continue handling the vast majority of everyday grid monitoring and control functions. That is a genuinely meaningful step forward, but it is worth setting realistic expectations, rather than assuming a fully quantum-powered power grid is about to appear within the next 2 years. There is a helpful parallel worth drawing here to how other sectors have approached this exact same hybrid quantum classical transition, because the power grid is far from the only critical system racing to prepare for a quantum future, while today's hardware still remains genuinely limited. Financial institutions have spent recent years running quantum algorithms on small, specialized portfolio optimization problems, gradually building institutional expertise and refining their approaches, without expecting quantum B computers to fully replace their existing risk modeling infrastructure anytime soon. Pharmaceutical companies have taken a similar approach with quantum chemistry simulations, using today's limited quantum hardware to tackle small, carefully chosen molecular modeling problems that classical computers genuinely struggle with, while continuing to rely primarily on classical computing for the vast majority of ordinary drug discovery work. The Power Grid Security Project fits neatly into that same broader pattern, an industry deliberately building quantum expertise and infrastructure today on realistically scoped problems, specifically. So the underlying knowledge and institutional capability will already exist and be battle-tested by the time quantum hardware eventually matures enough to handle dramatically larger, more consequential tasks. Now, let's widen the lens even further, because the power grid represents just one piece of a much larger post-quantum cryptography transition happening simultaneously across nearly every sector of American critical infrastructure and private industry. Major technology companies have been racing to implement post-quantum protections across their own infrastructure for years now. Google has been actively experimenting with post-quantum cryptography across its services since, well, before 2024. Akamai, one of the internet's largest content delivery networks, enabled post-quantum cryptography support at the network edge back in 2025. Major web infrastructure providers, including Fastly and the popular web server software Nginx, have all rolled out post-quantum cryptography support during this same general period. Microsoft made post-quantum cryptography application programming interfaces generally available across its platforms in late 2025, giving software developers building on Microsoft's Infrastructure Direct, ready-made tools to start implementing quantum-resistant encryption in their own products without needing to build that capability entirely from scratch themselves. Despite all of that industry-wide momentum, a detailed 2026 academic measurement study specifically analyzing post-quantum readiness across the broader internet found that adoption, while genuinely accelerating, still remains far from universal, with significant gaps persisting across smaller organizations and legacy systems that have not yet prioritized this particular upgrade. That finding matters enormously when you connect it back to the power grid story specifically, because critical infrastructure operators, particularly smaller regional utilities, without the technical sophistication or dedicated cybersecurity budgets of a major technology company, are exactly the kind of organizations most likely to lag behind on this broader industry-wide post-quantum transition. The Air Force can quantum harden the specific grid segments most directly tied to military readiness relatively quickly, given focused funding and dedicated contractor expertise. Extending that same level of protection across the thousands of smaller utilities scattered throughout the rest of the country represents an entirely different, considerably larger, and slower moving challenge, one that will likely take years, or possibly even decades, to fully resolve. It is also worth understanding how this entire quantum grid security push connects to the official National Security Agency guidance, shaping how the American defense and intelligence community approaches quantum readiness more broadly. The NSA maintains a specific set of cryptographic algorithm requirements known as the Commercial National Security Algorithm Suite, commonly referred to as CNSA, which defense contractors and national security systems are required to eventually migrate toward as quantum-resistant standards mature and become finalized. The most recent version of that guidance, CNSA 2.0, establishes a phased timeline pushing national security systems toward full post-quantum compliance over the coming years, with different categories of systems facing different deadlines depending on how sensitive and how long-lived the information they protect actually needs to remain secure. Power grid control systems, given their obvious connection to both civilian safety and military operational readiness, sit squarely within the kind of critical infrastructure category this broader federal guidance is specifically designed to eventually cover, even though grid systems have historically moved somewhat more slowly toward full compliance compared to more purely military communications. Systems given the grid's much larger, more decentralized, and more difficult to coordinate ownership structure, spanning thousands of separate utility companies, rather than a single unified government agency. Let's also address something that deserves honest acknowledgement here: the genuine uncertainty still surrounding exactly how much of a near-term threat quantum computing actually poses to encryption specifically, as opposed to the more immediately proven threat represented by conventional hacking campaigns like Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. Serious quantum computing researchers remain genuinely divided on exactly how many years away a quantum computer capable of actually breaking modern encryption at meaningful scale really is, with credible estimates ranging anywhere from the early 2030s to considerably later, depending heavily on how quickly error correction techniques continue improving and how much sustained funding continues flowing into the field. That uncertainty is precisely why the Harvest, now decrypt later threat model matters so much, and why defense planners are choosing to act now rather than waiting for more certainty to emerge. Even if a genuinely capable quantum computer remains a full decade away, any sensitive grid communications intercepted and stored today by a patient adversary like Volt Typhoon would still become readable the moment that capability finally arrives, regardless of how many additional years that eventually takes to materialize. Waiting for more certainty before acting essentially means accepting years of additional exposure for data that, once captured, cannot ever be retroactively protected after the fact. Stepping back to consider the broader strategic competition between Washington and Beijing one more time, it is worth noting that China faces essentially the exact same underlying vulnerability the United States is now scrambling to address, just pointed in the opposite direction. China's own critical infrastructure, power grids, water systems, telecommunications networks, faces comparable exposure to exactly the same kind of Harvest, now decrypt later threat from American and allied intelligence services who have their own well-documented history of sophisticated cyber operations targeting foreign infrastructure when strategically warranted. This mutual vulnerability creates a strange, uneasy symmetry underlying the entire quantum security race, where both major powers simultaneously race to harden their own infrastructure against exactly the kind of intrusion capability both sides are also actively developing and deploying against each other. Neither country holds a clean, one-sided advantage in this particular dimension of the broader competition, which arguably makes the race to quantum-hardened critical infrastructure First, an even higher stakes proposition than a simple offense versus defense framing might initially suggest, since falling behind in defensive hardening leaves a country simultaneously more exposed to an adversary capability that same country is very likely also actively developing and deploying against its own rivals. Let's talk about what ordinary people who do not work in grid engineering or defense contracting, should actually take away from a story like this. Because it is easy to watch something this technical and assume it has nothing to do with your own daily life. If you live in the United States or in any allied nation whose infrastructure sits inside a similarly interconnected grid, the electricity powering your home, your hospital, and your local water treatment plant is quietly caught up in exactly the same global competition, whether you ever think about it or not. That does not mean panic is the right response, since defense planners, utility companies, and cybersecurity researchers have been actively working this problem for years. And the Air Force contract discussed throughout this story represents one visible piece of a much larger, ongoing effort spanning federal agencies, private contractors, and academic researchers all working in parallel. But it does mean the comfortable assumption that critical infrastructure security is somebody else's problem, safely handled behind closed doors by people who know what they're doing, deserves a little more scrutiny than most people typically give it. There is a useful historical parallel worth drawing here too, because critical infrastructure vulnerability is not actually a new concern invented by quantum computing. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in protecting critical infrastructure against exactly the kind of sabotage and disruption capability each side assumed the other was actively developing, treating power grids, communications networks, and transportation systems as legitimate military. Targets worthy of serious defensive investment, even during periods when no actual armed conflict was underway. What makes today's version of that same basic dynamic genuinely different is the sheer speed and subtlety modern cyber capabilities allow. A Cold War era saboteur needed physical access to a target, took real personal risk, and left forensic evidence behind that could eventually be traced and attributed. A sophisticated state-sponsored hacking group operating today can achieve comparable strategic effects from thousands of miles away, hidden behind layers of compromised consumer routers and legitimate-seeming network traffic, while facing dramatically lower personal risk and often much greater difficulty of attribution for the country ultimately responsible. That shift in risk and attribution changes the entire strategic calculus surrounding infrastructure attacks in ways policymakers are still actively working through. A nation-state considering a disruptive cyber attack against another country's power grid faces a fundamentally different risk profile than one considering a conventional military strike against the same target. And that asymmetry helps explain why pre-positioning campaigns like Volt Typhoon have become such an attractive strategic option for states seeking leverage without triggering the kind of unambiguous, immediate military response a conventional attack would almost certainly provoke. Quietly embedding access inside civilian infrastructure years in advance without ever activating that access sits in a genuinely ambiguous strategic gray zone, difficult to definitively prove, difficult to attribute with total certainty in a way that would justify a proportional military response, and difficult to fully deter using the traditional tools of conventional military deterrence that worked reasonably well throughout most of the 20th century. That gray zone dynamic is precisely why building genuine technical defensive capability, rather than relying purely on deterrence through the threat of retaliation, has become such a central pillar of how the United States now approaches this particular category of threat. You cannot always deter an adversary from quietly positioning itself inside your infrastructure if that adversary calculates, correctly or not, that the strategic benefit of maintaining that quiet access outweighs the relatively modest diplomatic cost of eventually being publicly named and shamed for it. What you can do, however, is make that pre-positioned access progressively less valuable and less reliable over time by continuously hardening the underlying systems, upgrading detection capability, and closing the specific technical vulnerabilities that made the original intrusion possible in the first place. That is really the core strategic logic underlying the entire quantum grid security push discussed throughout this story, not an attempt to somehow prevent every future intrusion attempt outright, an almost certainly impossible goal given the scale and complexity of national infrastructure, but a sustained effort to make whatever access an adversary has already quietly achieved progressively less useful and less trustworthy for them to actually rely on when it might eventually matter most. If you are finding this kind of deep dive into the quieter, more consequential side of the tech and defense world useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there is a lot more of this coming. And let's zoom out and talk about what this specific Air Force and Eaton partnership actually looks like in practice, because the technical details matter for understanding just how ambitious this project really is. The core problem Eaton, Inflection, and Penn state researchers are tackling is what security professionals call multi-domain threat correlation, essentially teaching a system to recognize when a series of seemingly unrelated events, a strange sensor reading here, an unusual login attempt there, a brief communication drop somewhere else entirely, actually represent pieces of a single coordinated attack rather than random, unconnected noise. Classical computers struggle with this kind of problem specifically because the number of possible combinations across a sprawling national grid with thousands of interconnected substations and millions of individual sensors grows so enormously large that even powerful supercomputers can take too long to meaningfully analyze every relevant combination in real time. Quantum computing offers a fundamentally different approach to exactly this kind of combinatorial complexity. Certain classes of quantum algorithms are specifically well suited to searching through enormous, complex solution spaces far more efficiently than classical brute force methods ever could, which is precisely why quantum computing keeps showing up in conversations about optimization problems, whether that is optimizing a financial portfolio, designing a new drug molecule, or in this case, figuring out whether three simultaneous anomalies scattered across a national power grid represent an actual coordinated attack. The hybrid quantum classical approach, specifically mentioned in Eaton's contract, reflects the reality that current quantum hardware, while genuinely useful for certain narrow tasks, still is not powerful enough to replace classical computing entirely. Instead, engineers are building systems where quantum processors handle the specific pattern recognition and optimization tasks they are best suited for, while classical computers continue handling the broader system management and communication tasks. Quantum hardware is not yet ready to take on. Inflection's role in this partnership deserves a closer look too, because it reflects a broader pattern happening across the entire American quantum industry right now. Inflection specializes in neutral atom quantum computing hardware, a specific technological approach that some researchers believe may prove easier to scale toward larger, more stable qubit counts compared to some competing quantum hardware designs. Bringing that specialized hardware expertise directly into a defense-focused infrastructure project reflects exactly the kind of public-private partnership the Pentagon has increasingly leaned on across nearly every emerging technology sector, recognizing that cutting-edge quantum research increasingly happens inside specialized private companies rather than purely within government laboratories, and that national security now depends on building close, trusted relationships with exactly those companies rather than trying to replicate their expertise from scratch inside a government agency. Pennsylvania State University's involvement adds yet another important piece to this puzzle, representing the academic research pipeline that underpins nearly every major American defense technology initiative. University researchers bring deep expertise in power systems engineering specifically, the kind of decades-old, highly specialized knowledge about how electric grids actually behave under stress that complements the newer quantum computing expertise Inflection contributes, and the practical industrial engineering experience Eaton brings from decades of building real-world power management equipment. That three-way combination, defense funding, private quantum hardware expertise, and deep academic power systems knowledge, reflects exactly the kind of coordinated, full-stack approach genuinely difficult national security problems increasingly require, because no single institution, government, university, or private company actually possesses every piece of expertise needed to solve a problem this complex entirely on its own. It is worth stepping back here and asking a bigger, more uncomfortable question, because the Eaton contract, as significant as it is, represents a genuinely small piece of an enormously large puzzle. The American power grid is not a single unified system that a single $7 million contract could ever fully secure on its own. It is a sprawling, interconnected patchwork of thousands of separate utilities, many of them small, regional operators without anywhere near the cybersecurity budget or technical sophistication of a major national defense contractor. Some of the most successful Typhoon intrusions specifically targeted smaller, under-resourced utilities precisely because those organizations often lack the dedicated cybersecurity staff and advanced monitoring tools that larger utilities and defense-adjacent infrastructure typically maintain. Quantum hardening, a handful of the most strategically significant grid segments connected to military installations, does not automatically protect the thousands of smaller utilities scattered across the country that keep hospitals, water treatment plants, and ordinary neighborhoods running every single day. That gap between strategic priority infrastructure and the broader civilian grid represents one of the most genuinely difficult unsolved problems sitting underneath this entire story. The federal government can absolutely prioritize quantum hardening the specific grid segments most critical to military readiness, and that is clearly exactly what this Air Force contract is designed to accomplish. But a coordinated adversary looking to cause maximum chaos during a moment of geopolitical crisis does not necessarily need to target the most heavily defended military-adjacent infrastructure at all. Disrupting power to a handful of major metropolitan areas through smaller, less defended regional utilities could achieve a strategically similar level of chaos and disruption, without ever needing to break through the kind of quantum-hardened defenses this new Air Force initiative is specifically building. Closing that broader gap will require sustained investment reaching far beyond a single defense contract, extending into thousands of individual utility companies across the country, many of which are still years away, from even beginning a serious post-quantum security upgrade of their own. This is precisely why the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the organization responsible for setting mandatory reliability standards across the entire American grid, has been under increasing pressure to update its own baseline security requirements to reflect exactly this kind of coordinated multi-domain threat. The existing N-2 planning standard, requiring grid infrastructure to withstand 2 simultaneous equipment failures, was a genuinely reasonable baseline. For an earlier era, focused primarily on accidental failures and natural disasters. It was never designed around a sophisticated state actor deliberately orchestrating multiple precisely timed failures across both physical equipment and digital control systems simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of coordinated threat researchers now believe groups like Typhoon are specifically positioning themselves to execute. Updating that regulatory baseline across an entire national grid involves years of technical study for industry negotiation and regulatory rulemaking, a process that inevitably moves far slower than the pace at which both quantum computing capability and adversarial infiltration continue advancing in parallel. Let's bring this back to the bigger picture one more time, because everything in this story ultimately connects back to a single, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the headlines. For years, cybersecurity experts warned that critical infrastructure represented a genuinely underprotected soft target compared to more heavily defended military and financial systems. Those warnings turned out to be accurate, confirmed repeatedly through documented Chinese state-sponsored intrusions stretching back to at least 2021 and continuing actively through 2026. At the exact same time those warnings were playing out in real time, an entirely separate technological revolution, quantum computing, has been rapidly maturing, threatening to eventually make the encryption, protecting whatever infrastructure remains, standing obsolete almost overnight, whenever a sufficiently powerful quantum computer finally arrives. The Air Force's new partnership with Eaton represents one of the first, clearest, publicly documented signals that American defense planners understand. These two separate threats are not actually separate at all. They are converging into a single, unified national security challenge, and the response has to be built with both halves of that threat in mind simultaneously, rather than treating grid cybersecurity and quantum readiness as two disconnected problems to be solved independently, one after the other. So here's the real question worth sitting with after watching something like this. If the United States Air Force is quietly spending real money right now, specifically to quantum harden the power grid against a threat that has already been proven active and ongoing for years, while intelligence agencies openly describe Chinese hackers as pre-positioned special forces waiting quietly behind enemy lines for a signal that may or may not ever come, how much of ordinary daily life, the hospital down the street, the water treatment plant outside your town, the traffic lights you drive through every single day, still runs on infrastructure nobody has gotten around to protecting yet? The headline story here is not really about quantum computing at all. It is about a race between how fast an adversary can quietly position itself inside the systems modern life depends on, and how fast the people responsible for defending those systems can actually catch up before the moment eventually arrives when patience finally runs out on one side of that equation. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like so more people actually see this conversation, and subscribe if you want the next deep dive the moment it drops, because the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure stories like this one usually end up mattering a lot more than the flashy headlines everyone else is watching. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.